Hey guys, welcome back to the FPL Script, Season 1, Episode 2, looking ahead towards Gameweek 32. But just before we actually step into Gameweek 32, let's do a quick review of Gameweek 31. My team, at least, I made moves towards Trent with a hit from Chilwell. I also made the move towards Grealish away from Madison, so finally gotten rid of that little asset there. But Liverpool smashed Leeds this week, and that was pretty much the summary of the week for a lot of managers. I think that's the bulk of points for many players, alongside, of course, Solanke and Watkins, and where you fell in terms of team structure. I think going back to Salah, of course, having a mega haul. In Game Week 29, there were some managers following a certain review line, a probably -8 or a -12, going Salah and Solanke, and they have profited every week,
Jam.
and they're looking at their Game Week 34 EV on review, and they're still laughing at the people who own Kane for this really important Bournemouth fixture where Kane actually got 2 points. That was pretty much the summary of the week. We also had a few upsets in terms of Saka and Fernandes, but I'll actually leave that towards you because maybe you enjoyed that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the fourth penalty miss that I have not had to bear, which is a nice thing, I suppose. But my luck ran out shortly after because, of course, neither of us own Solanke, and I didn't own any Liverpool assets against Leeds, so that was a terrible thing in hindsight. But of course, apart from that, I did Raya to Ederson because that was the move suggested by review. And to give it some context, I could have done Ward-Prowse to Grealish, but that would have left me with not being able to afford both Salah and Trent in 34. So I decided against it because, of course, I want both of them in the double game week. So you take the hits as you go, and at least I'm glad that one of us had a good week. Well, maybe I'm not glad, but it's good that you had a good week for the pod, I guess.
Yeah, the average rank is still pretty similar to last week. Fernandes, of course, someone that we own between the two of us, was probably the one major upset, I would say, because we don't, get to celebrate Salah hauls here in this podcast.
Yeah.
But Fernandes, of course, had a lot of teasing, I would say, thanks to Keylor Navas and his fantastic saves. Also Martial for not finishing the chance that actually led to the Anthony first goal. But other than that, I think let's move on to 3-hit-34 and just talk about the transfers for that before we step into the actual real free hit, I suppose, for this week, which is 3-hit-32. So some managers, of course, are still going on this 3-hit-34 trajectory. They've planned to do this for quite a while now. And I think a lot of these managers actually did a line of play where they went for bench boost 27, therefore getting themselves 2 Arsenal assets as opposed to 1. And they're in a situation now where it actually does seem quite positive to go 34, presumably if they had Haaland all this time, or if they enjoyed Salah and Trent this week. What are the priority transfers if you don't have someone like Trent?
Yeah, so I mean, for free 34, you're obviously looking at assets who will play in 32 and then probably have good fixtures in both 32 and 33. So I think if you can triple up on Liverpool, because in 34, you might get some price rises out of them as well. It's good to have 3 assets. So probably you're looking at maybe Salah, Trent, and Robertson. And if you are brave enough to venture into uncertain X minutes territory, you can go for Gakpo, and we'll come to that when we address free 32. But apart from that, I think 3 Arsenal, I think most people probably already own Saka and 1 defender out of Gabriel and Zinchenko. And assuming that Zinchenko is back fit, which I think he probably is, you can look to maybe go back to triple ups with someone like Odegaard, because again, if we look at long-term minutes, Odegaard is much more assured as everyone becomes fit and there are more fixtures crammed into whatever is left of the season. I think we should temper our expectations when it comes to minutes for Jesus Martinelli, not by a lot but by some margin, and that leaves us with Odegaard again being a long-term better option. So I think we can go with that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think just from the appeal, you've got forwards who play in 32, so you're probably going to make transfers towards midfielders if you don't have them currently. So I think that's the landscape for 3-hit-34 players. But of course, the bigger talking point for this week, and I think around 75% of engaged managers based on polls that I'm looking at seem to have 3-hit-32 in mind. So 3-hit-32 is a huge discussion. I think the starting point is probably looking at 1 or 2 optimal teams. You've got FPL Review's model to hand.
Yes, so I mean, if you're looking at a purely MD model on FPL review, we are looking at a 4-4-2, and this is a zero risk draft where essentially you're not betting against the field in most cases. So in case of similar EV, or like when the EV is differentiates bit like in decimal points. So basically you're looking at Johnston in goal. And I'm only talking about the starting 11 because we are not concerned much about the bench because depending on your team value, maybe you can have some better alternatives on your bench. So Johnson in goal, we have Trent, Gabriel, Robertson, and Trippier in your defense. We have Salah captain, Saka vice captain, Odegaard, and Madison. And forward line is Solanke and Watkins. So this has an expected value of something around 66.3 points or something, and that will of course change as the hive mind X minutes change because we get news in the press conferences and stuff like that. But what are your first thoughts when you look at this team?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing with the 4-4-2 is that you're now incorporating Trippier into the team and Gabriel, which a lot of managers don't seem to be doing. I think the template actually is a 3-back formation right now, whether you play a 3-5-2 or a 3-4-3. So that's probably the interesting thing, and that probably suggests, of course, that Review has really good estimates for clean sheet odds for Arsenal. Whereas, for example, I saw on Twitter today with 11ify's model himself, he's got actually higher clean sheet odds for Liverpool, which probably suggests why a lot of people are thinking about that sort of 3-4-3 default formation, or 3-5-2, where you play Trent and Robertson and Trippier instead, and therefore hedge around Arsenal attack entirely.
Yeah, and also I think if you want to increase your risk, what happens is someone like Eze comes into the team instead of Trippier, so you end up playing one of the more common formations that you are seeing online, which is a 3-5-2.
That makes sense. Do you also have Mikkel Tokvam's template free hit?
So there are slight differences between Review and Tokvam's free hit kind of projection, like which players they have picked. So going over Tokvam's team, and this is again assuming that you have minimal kind of value associated with your bench. So you end up with Pope in goal instead of Johnston. You have Trippier, Robertson, Alexander-Arnold in defense. So no Gabriel. You have Salah captain, of course. You have Bowen, which is, I think we'll come to that. Odegaard, Martinelli, and Madison. So no Saka. And Jesus, Tony as your strikers. So the glaring differences obviously is no Saka in this draft, and going with Bowen and Madison both, who are sort of in the 8 million-ish bracket, midfielders. And so what do you think, like in terms of popularity and also in terms of like risk management, what do you think of this draft?
Yeah, I think I quite like this draft structure, but what does concern me is someone like Bowen. I feel like West Ham, when you look at their underlying stats, and even Bowen's this season, noticeably quite low. Not really a team that I'd like to sort of go for, particularly in an away game. I know West Ham have actually been really good away from home when it comes to underlying stats like expected goals conceded. So they've been actually a top 3 defense in the league away, but that doesn't really say much about Bowen and his ability to do well in this free hit. And over the course of this season, the underlying stats have dropped off a cliff, and you've also lost Bowen, year on year with the penalties too. So not exactly the asset I want to go for when you have other options like Eze and Madison, who probably arguably have easier fixtures.
Yeah, and also, speaking of not having Saka in this draft and having Jesus instead, I think we can sort of focus on some of the micro kind of issues within free hit 32. So coming on to the first one, which is in terms of your Arsenal assets. So first thing first, do we go for Jesus plus a midfielder, or do we go for Martinelli, Odegaard plus a forward, or do we go for Gabriel plus a midfielder or a forward? Like, how do you rate all of these strategies? And also, what are your thoughts on each of their minutes? Like, because you've done an extensive kind of workup on kind of estimating every single player's X minutes for, I think, the top 50 players. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the interesting thing, I think, when you look at Arsenal is Review's expected minutes for Arsenal are noticeably low, and I think the assumption is that Arsenal will probably walk over Southampton, given how poor Southampton have been, and that just naturally lowers the X-mins for all the players. So you'll see actually Saka and Odegaard have lower X-mins than usual. So if you've been playing with Review this season, you'll know that Saka and Odegaard, their X-mins have dropped considerably. And based on the West Ham game, you'd probably suggest that Odegaard and Saka are still people who are only going to get subbed off at 90 minutes. But there is a chance, of course, if they are dominating Southampton, that they will be subbed off early. And that's going to change your X-Men guesses for these players, which also therefore strengthens how strong Gabriel sort of comes out as an option for one of your 3 Arsenal players within review. Whereas with a lot of the other models that I'm seeing, you don't really see the option of Gabriel getting spitted out, because particularly when you even look at market odds, options like Jesus, Martin, Odegaard, Saka, these are all fantastic. Like, their EV ceiling is super high, and you're probably going to base your draft around first the Arsenal players and the Liverpool players, and because they have higher EV, you're going to pick them over Gabriel. But with review, because the clean sheet odds are high and the X-Mins for the Arsenal attackers are less, that sort of created a balance there. So I think that some managers will have to make an assumption as to how potentially this Arsenal game will go. And even if, let's say, you are hedging around a game state that Arsenal are going to dominate, I guess you don't worry too much about X-Mins. You're just going to go with the upside of the Arsenal attack. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of on board with the idea that, because the most important fixture of their season is to come in 5 days, and it's going to be a question of like which, the red zone, and what is basically the fitness of all of these players. So in that sense, I understand why you have to be a little bit more skeptical than usual, and also because of the quality of the opposition. And Southampton have been so poor this season that game states might come into the picture more quickly than you might expect in any other game. Like, for example, I think even the West Ham game, you expected a tougher fight, which of course it happened. And in terms of, Jesus plus midfielders, what midfielders are we talking about here? Like, are we talking just Madison, Eze, or, is there anyone else that you think we can consider for that combination?
Midfielder wise, I mean, you showed Tokvam's model incorporating Bowen. So Bowen is actually technically a higher EV on Tokvam's model, but I'm not too high on Bowen as previously explained.
Yeah.
So it is actually between Eze and Madison. The reason why it's between Eze and Madison as well is because if you look at reviews, X-Men's sort of assumption for Eze and both Elise, it's actually very low compared to what they've played under Roy Hodgson. So if you look at the minutes of Eze, the interesting thing is he's played 90 minutes flat out straight for Roy, and he's not been subbed off once. So if you shoot his X-Mins to actually be comparable to Madison, just to actually be fair, assuming that these are both 90-minute players, which Madison usually is anyways, unless he gets injured, then Eze is actually a better option on review on the pure MD model. And that, to me, strikes as really interesting. I think a lot of people will probably be quite tempted by someone like Eze as a result of that.
Yeah, and also, I mean, Wolves are playing much better than they were, obviously, under different management. But again, it's Leicester created what is excess of 2xG against City, of course, because City made wholesale changes, and there are different reasons behind that. But I also think that it is quite encouraging in a way, because even if you are playing City's B team, you can only make 5 changes in that City team, right? And that City team was pretty much first team, like it was the strongest team they have. So in that sense, I think it's encouraging that Leicester could put up an XG like that with Dean Smith in charge now. So I don't think Madison is as bad a pick as, blanking against Bournemouth suggests. So, definitely he is one to consider on the free hit. And also, when we come to, let's say, you want to pick between Martinelli and Odegaard, what are your thoughts? And I know you have already spoken about their X minutes, but specifically for those two, like, how would you differentiate between the selection based on their minutes, because they're not that far apart in price, right? So, and I don't think we are under any budget constraints this season. So, we're just talking about A player or B player, even if they are like 1 million apart in price. So how would you go about that?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is once you sort of level Jesus and Martinelli's minutes, Jesus immediately becomes clear as an option to go for. And you can see a lot of the optimal models, even though they might have low estimations of Jesus minutes, he's already a clear option. So as you say, it's just purely between whether you believe you can add and sort of give Martinelli more minutes than he really should versus someone like Odegaard compared to like what the hive mind has estimated so far. So I would say with Martinelli, the issue for me is now that someone like Nketiah is fit, you have Trossard coming in as a sub, which is already going to be 15-25 minutes taken away from one player. However, with someone like Nketiah coming in, and he came in for practically 2 to 3 minutes in the West Ham game. But in the next game for Southampton, he could really come on for, I would say, probably once again 5 to 20 minutes, probably a little bit less than Trossard. He's not as much of a priority, I would say, but he can also interchange mostly with Jesus. But the assumption, of course, that Trossard would then just replace Martinelli in that instance. So I actually think that for some reason everyone's moving towards Martinelli because they probably are looking at things like gambling odds, etc., and or they just really like Martinelli as of late, and he's been probably the scariest asset in FPL if we're not just thinking purely on points, but just how scary an asset is so far. Martinelli is probably the one that everyone wants to go for, but I actually think that Odegaard makes more sense to keep in your team because of the threat of the substitutes and how strong they are in comparison to what the substitute would be for Odegaard, which is going to be someone like Fabio Vieira.
Yeah, so essentially it boils down to like how strong of a sub each of these players have in their positions, and then you kind of make a judgment call based on that. And also, like, in terms of the defensive assets, so I mean, maybe this is like anecdotal evidence, but I think that those that are not free hitting in 32, most of them own 1 to 2 Arsenal defenders. And I think that if you are one of those players that really is looking to hedge against people that are not playing your free hit, then I think you should just skip Arsenal defense entirely, right? Because the strongest point for Arsenal defense is minutes, and specifically Gabriel and Ben White. So, and right now I think the most popular Arsenal defensive asset is going to be Ben White, just because recently he scored, he's assisted, he's playing every single game now because he has no threat to his position now. And in that sense, how would you rate like 2 Arsenal midfielders against 1 midfielder? 3 Arsenal midfielders versus 2 midfielders and 1 defender?
I think it just comes down to whether you like Trippier as an option, because it seems like a lot of people going Gabriel will just bench Trippier, and that probably assumes you might be going for some sort of Kane draft. And I think that's actually, I feel like, why a lot of people have made that decision to go Trippier, because they think this is actually quite a bad week to go Kane. So funny that I would answer this way, but I think this free hit, particularly since you have to go through triple Arsenal and Liverpool, it's always about that odd man out. And in this instance, it's Trippier, because I'm not too fond of like a 4-4-2 structure. That's my kind of answer. I think I would prefer triple Arsenal mid, but going back to my initial point, I like Jesus more than Martinelli, and I think I'm going to lean towards going for something like Jesus, Odegaard, and Saka, because for me, Jesus and Martinelli will share close to similar minutes, but then Odegaard and Saka are supreme in that aspect.
Yeah, and I think I'm on a similar kind of thought process, but just to kind of close out that point, I think that when you're on a free hit, my personal kind of goal is to try and maximize the risk. It makes sense to not go attack versus defense, because every single person who, again, coming back to that point, which is maybe not relevant in, if you look at it holistically, but if you look at the field who is not free hitting, all of them are going to have conflicts all over the place, like Kane versus Trippier or Kane versus double Newcastle defense. And if you want to kind of maximize your risk, you should hedge on either side. And I am definitely on the side of hedging for a Newcastle clean sheet, but just with Trippier, because I think that there are better defensive assets from other teams to kind of fill up your team. Yeah. And so speaking of kind of, the 3 Arsenal assets, we also are planning on having 3 Liverpool assets. So if you look at, again, a similar kind of pattern where you are looking at either 2 defense, 1 midfielder, or you're looking at 1 defense, 2 midfielders. So kind of, can you help us run through the kind of possible combinations with them?
Yeah, I think as you can see, particularly with the optimal lineups that we've shown, it's most likely going to be Trippier, Robertson, Trent with a backline. So therefore you're playing double Liverpool defense as a bare minimum, and therefore just playing Salah. But with the recent game with Gakpo, I think a lot of people might just have a little bit of recency bias to pick a Liverpool forward, maybe Jota, maybe Gakpo. I really think Jota is out of the question, because you now have Luis Diaz back fit, and you also have Darwin Nunez who can play on the left. Whereas with Gakpo, his like-for-like sub is more someone like Firmino. But if you just look at the minutes, right, just to compare, someone like Darwin, he's had 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 70 minutes, 80 minutes recently. So these are the kind of minutes that you're choosing between. It's like pretty terrible, actually. So you have to sort of rate his X-Mins like really low. Whereas with someone like Gakpo, he's actually gotten very consistent starts and really good minutes in those starts. He's close to 80 to 90 on all of his starts. And the one game he was benched was a midweek rotation game versus Chelsea, where they were playing 3 games in 7 days, or around 9 days, which included 2 tough games, right? The City game and also the United game, I believe. Give or take one, I might be wrong with one fixture, but he was rested on that midweek game. So he's in a very similar position to someone like Alexander Isak from Newcastle, where because there's a good opportunity here to rest, and actually Gakpo got that rest by being subbed off at around 75, 80 minutes today, you now have an opportunity to probably gamble that Gakpo starts on this free hit. So I really like going for Gakpo and maybe probably pushing up and projecting his X-Mins to be something like 78 for the week ahead. And also looking at that as another option. I think that's interesting, particularly if you want to get rid of someone like Madison or Bowen or Eze, if you really think that these are not tempting options on your draft. Because once you put Gakpo into your team, you no longer have this sort of midfield conundrum of picking someone between Eze, Madison, Bowen, as we discussed. But you do create a new conundrum, which is basically what defender do you go for? And that creates an issue where you probably will have to go with someone like Anderson, because on all sort of projections for clean sheets, Crystal Palace is very clearly that sort of budget team, or even the third best clean sheet projected team. So then it becomes, do you actually double up on Crystal Palace defense? Because are you going John Stone as your keeper, and are you also backing that up with Guehi? And if you don't like that, you're just going to reduce the EV of your overall team by sort of hedging on another defense. And you're going to have to therefore look at side grades like Pope, which doesn't feel good because a lot of people go Trippier anyways. And if you look away from Pope, you're now looking into the territory of Raya and Leno. And the field, I think, will actually own Raya, who are non-free hitting.
Yes.
And Leno, of course, is that crazy differential punt. But I'm not too tempted in Leno at this point in time. I still like Crystal Palace defense, but the one drawback for Gakpo, in my opinion, is you have to gamble for X-Mins, which I actually like it for the free hit on 32, because I think I'm quite confident in it. But yeah, as I said, the issue is, what do you do with your defense? Do you sort of kneecap yourself by hedging a little bit and not going double Crystal Palace defense?
Yeah, and also I think you mentioned Leno, and I think Fulham's XGC this season has been really high, which
Crazy,
is it's not encouraging in terms of a clean sheet prospect. And just to be clear, with the Gakpo stuff, you are not thinking about Gakpo more because of the game that just happened, right? Because the last thing we want is for people to start overreacting to one result that went favorably for a player. Like, the key piece of information you got out of today's game was about his minutes rather than his points. Like, I just wanted to make that point clear, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely the case. I mean, if I really wanted to pick someone from this game, I guess it would be Jota, although he actually disappointed me for the first 30 minutes of the game. It was hard to watch.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he also completely fluked his second goal. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I think Gakpo, what I got from this game was just more X-Mins out of him. The ability to just push that a little bit higher and see what that means when I run solves with Gakpo with better X-Mins.
Yeah, but I mean, I mostly agree with everything you said with the X-Mins, but I still think that there is some uncertainty with Darwin, because, I mean, people can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I haven't heard a definitive reason from Klopp why he's being benched all of a sudden in every game. And that's so surprising, because like, he's literally the agent of chaos. Like, he just causes so much chaos in every game that you've seen Salah become so much more involved when Darwin is there, just because like everything is in disarray, not just the opposition defense. I think like all 22 players are probably in disarray when Darwin is on the field. So I think that kind of impact is crucial, I think, for Liverpool. So I don't know why that is being done, but maybe someone else, so Liverpool fans have a better idea, and please let us know if that is the case. So I guess we've covered the two best teams that everyone is going to triple upon. But if we move on to some differentials that we've already discussed, like let's say Eze, who I fear is not going to be as much of a differential as people might think. But I think Bowen is one differential that we discussed that neither of us is quite keen on. The other ones would be in the striker position, because I think there are a lot of strikers right now who have good underlying stats and have decent fixtures. So they can, we can capitalize on them on a free hit. So let's kind of run through, what do you think about, like, let's say Tony versus Solanke versus Kane, who is, I think, not going to be that highly owned, just because everyone on a free hit is probably going to go to these three cheap strikers, like any of the three cheap strikers.
Well, I think, recency bias will probably suggest there are going to be a lot of Eze and Solanke owners. But I don't really like Solanke's matchup for the same reason why I said I think West Ham is actually a very good away defense. I know review rates Solanke very highly and totally happy for people to go Solanke. Actually, what's interesting is all the picks that you've mentioned have very, very similar EV on a lot of different models. So you kind of have to pick almost 2 out of 5 strikers here, because if Jesus is nailed in your draft, you said that there's Tony, Watkins, Isak, Solanke, and Kane. With Tony, what you have to do on review is if you're running souls with him, you just need to manually adjust his minutes. So you need to click on him on review and change his minutes to something like 85, 86, assuming that he actually starts, which is probably the case. As far as Watkins, look, he's had insane XG very consistently on all sorts of difficulties of games as of late. So I think he's a crazy good option, and someone I actually will probably look at him where he's going to be a slight EO shield for me, because I still think the fixture is actually quite good, because Brentford defense have been slipping lately. The XG conceded has been trickling up a bit. I like Watkins for that reason, but for Kane, like this is really like one of the worst possible fixtures, so I'm dropping him. I'm not going to go for Kane, and I as I said, I'm going to go for a Trippier draft more than likely, and hedge towards that sort of scenario where Newcastle hopefully get a clean sheet, or that, you know, Trippier can do well in that game regardless, and that even if, let's say, Tottenham were to score, I still find it hard for Kane to get really good goal scoring odds or even assist chances. You'll see that this is a week that's really low for Kane, like worse than actually some of the options that we talked about. Isak for me is the golden differential here, because when you look at review and you look at the Hive minus minutes, it's quite low. But Isak for me falls into the exact same camp as Gakpo, but he's probably better, where I think he's absolutely nailed to start and actually to play 85 to 90 minutes. So
do you not think that it's more influenced by game states? Because we've seen that when Newcastle are chasing a game, Isak doesn't come off. You know, someone like Jacob Murphy is replaced by Callum Wilson, and they play with both Isak and Wilson, and Isak just continues playing till, you know, let's say they secure the win or they get the draw or whatever result they want to get to. So in that sense, do you think that it's more influenced by the game states that we've seen, or, you know, that are being predicted, as well as the inherent uncertainty of his injury record? Because I think that is a big thing to consider when it comes to players like Isak, who have a history of getting injured. So in that sense, do you think that you are taking a certain amount of risk, and maybe if you're already taking a risk with minutes for, let's say, Martinelli, Jesus, do you think that it's a bridge too far when it comes to like owning Isak on top of that?
I mean, interesting. I would say that if you look at outside of like purely MD, if you look at something like market odds, like Isak with really low X-mins, like even if you dropped it to 78, I'm not saying he's going to play 80 to 90 minutes. Like even if you just reduce it to like 75, or even on the boundary of 70, he's already clear of a lot of the options that we discussed previously, playing 85, 90 minutes. So that's kind of what gives me the confidence in gambling for Isak, because it feels like for him to meet that threshold of like 69 minutes, which I think is already good enough on, let's say, market odds for him to be actually a starting striker in your team, already kind of makes me very fond of Isak as an option. So I feel like it's less of a risk in terms of like the EV gap that you're losing compared to going for someone like Gakpo that I previously discussed, where there's such a good replacement option in Robertson. So that's kind of why I like Isak. And ultimately with Tony, I would like to probably hope for a good Aston Villa result, but given that I don't actually own Mings, Moreno, or Martinez, which a lot of people who are engaged have now picked up somehow in their teams, hopefully I guess someone else from Brentford would score. But yeah, I quite like Watkins. I quite like Isak out of the 5 that we mentioned, and Solanke not as high for me, but probably my third option outside of Jesus, of course, taking him out of the argument.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the field of players that we're looking at when it comes to free hit 32. And of course, you know, it's going to boil down ultimately to one more thing, which is captaincy, as it always does, especially the last 2 weeks that we've seen. You know, if you've captained Salah this week, if you've captained Holland in the past 2 weeks, you've kind of mitigated any potential damage that you might have suffered. So I have the picks from review. So I don't think the top 3 choices are going to be a surprise. So the top choice is Salah by a mile. The second choice is Saka, and the third choice is Trent Alexander-Arnold. And it's not very often that a defender is that high, but of course, you know, Trent and his attacking potential, so that makes sense. Do you have the transfer algorithm picks?
Yeah, it's exactly the same, but just in a different order where you have Salah once again as a very, very clear option. And then
Yeah.
it's Trent, who's also actually quite clear from Saka, but also very far away from Salah. And then Saka, a third option. But Saka, sorry, is so close to some of the other Arsenal options. It
Yeah.
seems like Tokvam doesn't even really rate him as a serious contender. So it's between Salah and Trent for Tokvam's model. But as you said, because Salah is such a clear option, we're expecting, of course, that he's still on penalties. And look, the game on paper versus Nottingham Forest at home is just scintillating. So, yeah.
So it's going to end Nottingham Forest 1-0, Avoni scoring a goal, right? I mean, that's what happened last time.
Yeah, let's not talk about that because I actually did captain Salah that week, so it wasn't
Yeah, as did
wasn't
I.
great.
That's
Yeah,
yeah, that's a lot of pain. But
yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's a good place to probably end this episode. And, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, absolutely not. Just captain Salah and profit.
Yeah, that makes sense. So have a good one, everyone.
Take care.